Well, here in Australia, we are still waiting for the jab. Around the world, people are getting vaccinated by the tens of millions against COVID-19. And with each shot, hopefully, bringing closer the end of the pandemic. But here's the interesting thing. You would think that it was the more left-wing and more progressive jurisdictions, the ones that went hardest on masks and restrictions and smashing their economies, all in the name of saving lives and preventing COVID-19 deaths, that would be bringing the vaccine forward the fastest. But it turns out it's actually just the opposite. Like, supposedly backward Great Britain, that nation of uncultured oiks who dared vote their way out of the European Union? Well, more than 10 million Britons have received at least their first dose of the vaccine. That's more than 15% of the population. They've gone so hard and so fast that it looks like they could have the pandemic under control there, not within years or months, but, according to the New York Times, within weeks. But sophisticated continental Europe? Not so fast. There, the whole vaccine program is such a mess, and the EU has been beset by exactly the sort of bureaucracy and centralisation that Britain sought to avoid when it got out of the EU, and which now is turning out to be deadly. There, on continental Europe, the EU has vaccinated just 3% of its population. It's so slow getting the vaccines out that in one recent 72-hour period, Bojo's Britain administered more jabs than France has in all the weeks since the shots became available. It's the same elsewhere. Justin Trudeau's Canada has vaccinated about 3% of its much smaller population. The United States, meanwhile, is continuing to deliver the nearly 1 million jabs a day that were begun under the Trump administration, meaning that right now almost 9% of that population has been vaccinated. Big difference. And within the U.S., Democrat states such as New York and California are far, far behind more conservatively governed states like West Virginia and the Dakotas. Part of the problem is that in the U.S., Democrat-run progressive states have turned vaccinations into a civil rights and social justice issue. As the New York Times noted last week, quote, a common blue state problem seems to be a focus on process rather than on getting shots into arms. Some progressive leaders are effectively sacrificing efficiency for what they consider to be equity. Where have we heard this before? In Seattle, appointments to receive the precious vaccine were canceled at one hospital when they decided the process wasn't, quote unquote, equitable enough. And it's a story being repeated around blue state America. As progressive commentator Ezra Klein was forced to admit, the parts of the country that pride themselves on taking COVID seriously and believing in government are not covering themselves in glory. And that's before we talk about a nation like Israel, which has already inoculated more than half its population and more than 3/4 of those Israelis over 50, which is, of course, the population group for whom COVID really starts to become dangerous. Now, there's a couple of points to make here. Number one, it's not hard to imagine what the reaction would be was it, say, Brexit Britain that was behind on the vaccine race rather than continental Europe. It would all be Brexit turns into literal suicide pact as enlightened Europe saves its people. But also it's fascinating to see how there's not a not so indirect correlation between just how left-wing a place it is and how quickly it manages to get the vaccine out. It's weird. The same side of politics that says it is all about science and saving lives seems to be most caught up in dragging the pandemic out for as long as possible. Whether that's due to simple incompetence or an addiction to the control over people's lives the pandemic has given governments and health officials is up to you, dear viewer, to decide.